morning. So I'm Gavin Kelly. I'm just getting us going this morning. I'm chairing it. I'm the chairman of the Resolution Foundation, chief executive of the Resolution Trust, and much more importantly, a friend, I think, of Timewise, and sort of helped Emma out over the years with things. Today's event it's a mouthful, isn't it? It's reaching a positive financial return on investment in flexible working, which I'm really looking forward to because I think this gets to the heart of some really important issues that I hope we can collectively kick around. Everybody in this room knows that the whole debate of flexible working has been transformed. Well, it's been transformed over about 20 years, but it's been particularly transformed over the last 2 years for reasons we're all familiar with. But despite that, and yet for all the attention that we all know about in terms of discussions about hybrid and work from home and all the things that we read about every day, we also know that there's been a lot of reticence and caution about sort of delivering flexible work for large swathes of the workforce working in frontline roles, where working from home isn't basically a realistic option for most of those people. And there's lots of different sectors we could talk about. I'm sure we'll touch on retail, care, construction and others, NHS and so on. That's a lot of the workforce. And a lot of the conversation we have about flexibility frankly passes those people by at the moment. And that's a really key issue. And there's kind of reasons for that. I think, and we'll get into some of those, it is challenging in some ways. In the past, it's definitely what's so now and in the past, margins have been tight in many of those sectors. Labour has traditionally felt relatively easy to access and to find, whereas flexible job design in the frontline roles can feel very challenging to employers, to managers and others. Now, the work that Timewise has done over the last few years in its pilot work, which we'll be hearing a bit about, has shown, I think beyond any doubt, that you can achieve real flexibility in these settings. It is feasible, and I think that's been shown really, really compellingly from the work that has been shown and we'll be hearing about, which is fantastic. But feasible doesn't necessarily mean desirable for everyone, and that to prove desirability, you have to get into the business case. And people want to see numbers, people want to understand. Of course, when you're doing something challenging, it brings some costs, it brings some change and upheaval, and people want to understand what the benefits might be from that upheaval and when you're going to realise them. And that's really what we're going to be getting into today, because a lot of the conversation, I think, about flexibility in those sorts of challenging workplace settings, I think has kind of people use the language of business case and so on, but we haven't had the numbers. So today is an important sort of contribution, I think, to trying to fill that gap. I mean, I would just say, stepping back from that particular conversation, it feels incredibly timely, given if I look at the reports that have landed on my desk in the last few weeks. I think probably no doubt one of them Tony's been involved in. We've got people saying we've actually seen a tilt towards more low-paying shift-based work over the last year or two. The IFS had a report out saying that there's been a bit of a tilt in the labour market towards more of those roles recently. We know that we've got almost record levels of job-to-job moves, so employers are on the end of a high level of churn and the costs that come with churn. That is a feature of today's labour market, and we also know that we're missing an awful lot of workers as a result of the pandemic who are no longer in the workplace, particularly older workers, and that we want to try to do what we can to tempt some of those workers back. And I'm willing to wager that flexibility will have a significant role in that conversation. So these are really big issues for how labour market and how indeed our economy works. So they're obviously vital for workers and employees. They're obviously vital for employers. You might think they'd be vital for government too. And there is lots of thinking going on in different bits of government. I think some of that thinking flies past what we sometimes read about, like ministers walking around leaving passive-aggressive notes in civil service desks, and gets into the real crunchy issues that we want to talk about. And I'm pleased actually we've got some civil service representation today, I think, from the task force looking at flexible work, which is great. So we've got a great panel to get into this, which I will just briefly introduce. But as important, we've got all of you. You're not here by accident. Everyone who's around this table is here because they've got something to say and something to bring. So we want to make sure we've got time for a conversation. So I will try and ensure that is the case. But we also want to make sure you've got time for a cup of coffee at the end for those who want to stay before they leave the room. We get booted out by 11:30, I'm reliably told. So we'll try and make sure that if we can, we'll finish at about 11:10 to give people a chance to have a natter if that's what they wish to do. And some people will have to run off. In terms of our speakers, we're going to hear first from Emma Stewart, who I think you all know, co-founder of Timewise. Then we're going to hear from Tony Wilson, Director of the Institute for Employment Studies, whose organisation actually did the hard work, I think, no doubt with Timewise, of the research. And then we're going to hear from Matthew Percival, Programme Director Skills and Inclusion at CBI, and then Michael Drivers, People Director at Sir Robert McAlpine. So that is the plan. When we get you to speak, we're not going to go around the table because we haven't got that long and it will take too much time, so apologies. I know not everyone will know each other, but do say who you are and where you're from, not least because I won't know all of you like that. And to indicate, and we'll try and make it flow as best we can. Is that okay? Anyone want to get out there? Any other ground rules I should have mentioned?
No, that's it.
Great, okay, I think we should get going.
Brilliant. Karen, thank you. I feel that's almost everything I need to say, and that's a brilliant introduction. Thank you for supporting our work. Thank you all for coming. Thank you to Barclays for hosting us, for funding the work, and also our wider programme of work more broadly. And thank you to Tony, Institute for Employment Studies, for doing the hard numbers, which I took about 2 months to understand, but I'm there now, and I think they're really, really good. So I'm just going to take about 10 minutes to talk through the headlines of this research, which we published last week in collaboration with the Institute for Employment Studies. First, just a little bit of context. So most of you know that Timewise is on a mission and has been for 17 years to make good flexible work the norm. We see that as benefiting individuals, we see that as benefiting businesses, and we see that as benefiting the wider economy. This latest report is part of our current programme called Fair Flexible Futures, and please do, by the way, use the hashtag if you want to tweet. Feel free to today, we will be live tweeting as well. The purpose of this programme is to explore specifically what impact the pandemic has been having on how we look to design better work for the future and make sure that our workplaces are more inclusive and fair and that flexible work is embedded for everybody. We are particularly, as Gavin said, focused on frontline workers. We see they are being left behind by the hybrid working revolution, and we want to see how we can avoid the risk of a two-tier workforce that flex haves and have-nots, as we call them, from growing even more. Why does this matter? Again, obvious reasons. It matters for millions of frontline workers because it means giving them fairer access to good flexible work, more autonomy and control over how much, when and where they work. And that matters because in turn, it increases their job satisfaction, it increases their well-being, it helps them to manage the cost of work, whether it's travel and childcare, and it ultimately, we hope, helps people move into work, stay in work, and progress in work, which in the living standards crisis we are facing is absolutely vital for the future economy. But it also matters for employers in these sectors, whether you go from retail through to social care. We know that giving people more autonomy and control over how they work can help attract a wider talent pool. That is sorely needed, as Gavin said, in this tight labour market that we're in, and I know Tony's going to talk more about. It also helps to retain staff, and ultimately improving job satisfaction helps to improve performance. But we talk to employers day in, day out at Timewise. We run a whole range of programmes in consultancy, and I've got various colleagues here today who'll be really happy to talk to you more about it. But what we hear are two challenges from employers when we talk to them if they are in frontline industries. The first is they are still struggling to work out how to make flexible working work for all of their employees, how to make it fair and consistent, and how to design different jobs and different kind of roles. And that is particularly complex in frontline environments where you're in teams and we have operational constraints on where you physically are working. The second thing we hear is that there is a persistent lack of leadership commitment from some, not all, and we've got a great example where that is not the case, since we're at McAlpine today. But there is a lack of leadership commitment to invest in organisation-wide change, to trial innovative new ways of designing work, and to upskill specifically managers to roll this out. So we've already done a lot of work to try and look at the first challenge, to look at how we can make flexible working work. And over the last few years, we have run a range of pilots, specifically through our innovation unit, looking at, we've worked in 5 different frontline sectors, and we've brought employers together to scope, design and test how to create flexible working opportunities for people on the front line. And we share the results at industry level because the drive for Timewise is to try and find out what works and then to promote that so that we can scale change at scale. Because we hear day in, day out businesses saying, I know this is the right thing to do, but I don't know how to do it. The results from those pilots have proven that it is possible to give frontline workers flexibility, to give them greater choice and control over time-based flexibility alongside location flexibility. Whether it's start and finish times of your day, whether it's more advanced notice in your shifts, or whether it's thinking about part-time working. Again, I'm going to say it repeatedly, there are lots of other ways of flexible working, not just hybrid working. And we have evidence at pilot level, the results, and they've been really positive, both for businesses and for workers. But that is at pilot level. Since then, we've also started to scale out that work. I'm delighted we've been working over the last year as a result of our nursing pilots and our other work in NHS. We've recently trained 100 NHS trusts in how to think about improving flexible working. We've also worked with 400 schools across the country to think about flexible working in education. So we're starting to dissipate this learning, but there's a lot more that needs to be done. So the reason we undertook this research is we wanted to address that second challenge. We wanted to demonstrate that the cost of investing in flexible working is worthwhile. And we need to face the fact that working time improvements are fundamentally no different to pay. They cost employers to make happen. We don't say that enough. We need to acknowledge it. And we need to also, by doing that, assess the return on investment. That's a conversation we've not really been having. And in doing this, we also need to challenge a perceived assumption that still does persist in many firms, that offering flexible work can actually be at odds to business performance, which we know from our work is not true. So that's the context. In terms of the research, you've all seen a summary copy, and I hope you've had a chance to look at the full report. It's a tome, so I'll excuse you for not having read it from end to end. And as I said, Institute for Employment Studies created a huge amount of really fascinating analysis. The objective was twofold. First, we wanted to calculate the cost of firms investing in embedding flexible working. Now, that was specifically looking at what it would cost to run a flexible working pilot to test and learn how to create flexible work on the front line. And we used our own model, but we've worked with industry consultancy rates, and we've also calculated the cost of internal staff time to do that. So that is the cost of effectively doing a pilot with around about 200 people in a team or in an organisation. Then we looked at the potential savings through sickness and turnover that would need to be made to recoup these costs and over what time frame that would happen. And we've looked at those two areas because based on wider research, and it's really important here to acknowledge that there isn't a huge amount of longitudinal cost-benefit analysis on the direct impact of flexible work on business performance. But using a range of data sets, we know that there is a link between reduced sickness and absence and turnover and improved flexible working. We also are recognising that right now, this is very timely, because if we think about what's happening in the labour market, we have the great resignation that we're all talking about. People are leaving. And we also have considerably high levels of sickness and absence. I mean, just this morning, I had 4 people drop out, 2 of them because their kids were ill, 2 because they were ill. You know, it's everywhere. So this is really timely and really important. And we focused on 5 sectors that we've already operated in. We focused on retail, teaching, construction, the NHS, specifically nursing, and domiciliary social care. So what did we find? So the key finding is that employers would only have to make really small marginal gains in turnover and sickness absence in order for a pilot intervention to more than pay for itself. I'm going to give you one example. You have to excuse me. I'm going to read because the numbers. So in a construction firm of around 200 employees, 68 typically leave in any one year based on industry analysis around turnover. And about 8 days of sickness each person would take a year. So we've got each person being on average about 8 days of ill health a year and potentially 68 people leaving. If you look at the break-even analysis in implementing a flexible working programme, all we need is for 7 fewer staff to leave each year for the investment in flexible working to be recovered, or 1 less sick day per person per year over 3 years, and you've covered the cost of implementing a change programme. And that analysis is broadly the same across all the sectors that we looked at. So effectively, what it's saying is it doesn't take much in savings on sickness and absence to cover the costs of implementing flexible working for frontline workers in terms of paying for itself in savings. Anything else beyond that is upside, and there is a lot of upside. It also suggests to us that the potential for scalable returns is significant. Tony and I did some modelling off the back of this research recently, and we estimate that a large firm could save as much as £1 million per year in reduced sickness and turnover by improving flexible working if you scale up those figures to a firm of around about 1,000 people. And that's before any of the wider benefits are taken into account, such as the benefits we all know and we all talk about: improved well-being, increased diversity, wider access to talent, and improvements in performance. And that's not even before we start to think about how happy and committed and loyal people feel because they're working flexibly and they're given more autonomy and control. So what does this tell us? Well, it tells us that the scale of potential returns are huge. These 5 sectors between them employ over 8 million people. And we looked at the end of last year, between them they had 400,000 unfilled vacancies. Now that represents hundreds of organisations struggling to find solutions to tackle skills and talent and lost productivity through sickness and absence. Now there are clearly significant other factors at play in terms of how to maximise business performance, but flexible working has to be one of them. And we think that employers in these sectors should no longer ignore the cost of not investing in flexible work as part of the solution. And the findings also have much wider significant implications when we think about labour market challenges as well, in the context of tackling persistent structural barriers that trap so many people out of work or in low pay due to a lack of quality flexible work. And in particular, as I know Tony will talk about, this is relevant if we think about the numbers of people that are dropping out of the labour market and are missing from the labour market post-pandemic. So what needs to be done? Firstly, just to make an obvious point, we believe we need to continue to challenge the assumption that flexible working can't work in frontline roles. It can. We've got examples, we've proven it, we just need to share that learning. But more broadly, we also need to help employers to realise the value of investing in flexible job design solutions and equipping managers to support this. The commercial returns that flow from not just testing, but embedding organisational change at scale. And whilst recent analysis actually just out from the CIPD tells us that 1 in 5 office workers still have access to home working, I mean, it's probably more than that, I would imagine. Our analysis through this research shows that 95% of frontline workers do not have any access to formal flexi time, which we're using as proxy for all other forms of flexibility. That's 95%, that means only 5% have. So we have a really long way to go to get the balance right. So we've put a number of recommendations through in the report. I won't go through all of them, but do have a look in the summary. 2 things to call out. One, obviously, we're asking employers to take action, but for you in the room, if you're in a trade body or an industry body, we're calling on you, and we will be calling on other trade bodies, please to share this research and to require, ask, incentivise, support, encourage your members to take action on flexible working as part of tackling some key workforce challenges. Just as they invest in skills and technology, we need to be investing in job design as well. And we're also clear for government. Those of you who know me will know I am a broken record on this. I've been saying it for about 4 years, but we need to provide catalyst funding to incentivise employers in frontline industries who are struggling to do this, to get practical, to test and find ways through workforce trials to innovate different ways of job design. Because whilst we can put the business case out there and we can give examples, there is more that still needs to be done, whether that's through the government's flexible working task force, or potentially by creating a fund through something like Innovate UK. So where does that leave us? Well, please, in conclusion, do go away and share our report. Please, we just wanted to get into the hands of as many employers as possible. Please advocate for flex for frontline workers. We can't assume, as some employers have said to us, that the job's done. We've had a pandemic, we all work flexibly, that's fine. It's not done. Many are actually going back in terms of ways of working, and we do really need to think about how we can make this fair for everybody. Flexible working does not just mean hybrid working. In the meantime, at Timewise, we are going to continue to build more evidence of what works and practice to help drive scalable action. So this summer, I'm really pleased that we are going to be launching a major 2-year programme. It's been supported by Impact on Urban Health and Barclays Life Skills. And we're going to try and do this for real. We're going to track over the next 2 years how firms can test, but also embed a fairer and more consistent approach to flexible working. I'm going to try and measure the impact on frontline workers' well-being as well as on business performance. We're working with 3 large employers operating within the NHS, construction and retail, and I'm really delighted that Strong McAlpine is going to be our leading construction firm who'll be working with us on this pilot. I'm sure Michael will talk a bit about it in a minute. So lots more to do, but I'm really happy to take questions at the end. I'll hand back to Gavin and really keen to hear reflections from the panel. Thank you.
Excellent. Really clear, and also really clear marching orders for everyone. Typically so thank you, Emma. I think we should just move straight on. Tony, you're going to put this in the context of the wider jobs market, aren't you?
I will, thanks, Gavin, and yeah, some brief comments. They may be even briefer now that Gavin's been able to put some of this in the context already at the start, and Emma set out the findings from the report. We were really delighted to work with Timewise on this project and be helping to make the case for flexible working and better job design and supporting sort of improvements in health and wellbeing and participation in the labour market. We're putting some of this in labour market context. I think if we look back 2 years ago and would have thought forward to us sort of gathering 2 years on, I think we would have all anticipated we'd be talking about very different sorts of challenges. We would have probably thought we'd have been talking about record levels of unemployment and how we deal with the scars and the lasting impacts on residents, on communities of long-term unemployment, disadvantage, coming out of a huge recession, a huge labour market shock. And the reality is, we've avoided that. Thankfully, we've avoided that unemployment crisis, potential catastrophe that many were predicting 2 years ago. But instead, I think we're facing 2 challenges now, which in many respects are going to be tougher for us to grapple with over the next few years and harder for employers and policymakers and practitioners to find solutions for. The first is around participation, and the second is this recruitment and job filling crisis we're facing. And both of these really get to the heart, I think, of why this research and this work and the work that Timewise do is so important. On participation, we've been saying since last year that we think there's around 1 million fewer people in the labour force now than there would have been had the pre-pandemic trends of rising participation continued. Most of that is explained by fewer older people in work. When we say fewer older people, in fact, I mean mainly people in their 50s, which is not that old, fast approaching for me, and many of us are there already. So this is not really old people in a conventional sense. It's older people who've left the labour force, been victims of job changes and industrial change over the last 2 years, but also as a result of lower migration, as a result of more young people staying in education and other factors. This participation crisis, though, is helping to fuel a recruitment crisis. Low unemployment, lower migration, fewer people entering the labour force, about the same number of people leaving the labour force as before, but fewer people entering the labour force, means that it's now the toughest labour market, the tightest labour market, I should say, for firms we've seen in at least 50 years. We've got 1 unemployed person per vacancy. During the pandemic, there were around 4 unemployed people for every vacancy. Go back to previous recessions, it was above 10. Even on the eve of the crisis, when the labour market was really firing on many cylinders, if not all cylinders, we had around 1.5 to 2 unemployed people per vacancy. This is the tightest labour market we've seen in at least 50 years. Now, this is being driven too, it's worth saying, by record turnover in jobs. We talked about this recruitment crisis, but this record turnover in jobs is job-to-job changes. This is predominantly not people entering work. We've got people leaving work and increasing challenges around long-term disadvantage and dislocation from work. Now, at the same time, within work, what we're seeing is, unsurprisingly, many of you would have experienced this too, we're seeing people working longer hours, we're seeing part-time jobs becoming fuller time, we're seeing work intensification, particularly with hybrid working, and we're seeing greater demands for mostly staying work. And some of this too is being driven by industrial changes through the changes in the sorts of work that we do through the pandemic, in particular things like increased pressure on health services, increased investments in the public services that were responding to the pandemic. We've actually now got levels of overemployment, and overemployment is defined as people who are working more hours than they want to work fewer hours and would do so for less pay. So actually people who would willingly take less pay for fewer hours, highest levels of overemployment on record. 3.5 million people say that they are working more hours than they would want, and if they could have less hours, they would take them and take lower pay. We've actually got the lowest level now of underemployment. That is people who've got low hours and want more hours. Lowest level of underemployment since 2007. So the IFS analysis is quite interesting because I think this as well gets to how we understand the labour market, the difference between flows and stocks, between turnover and levels. Turnover is being driven by turnover in low paid work. It always has been. The problem is firms can't fill those jobs. The growth actually, and this is the opportunity, the growth in levels of employment is often in higher skilled work. We're actually seeing low skilled employment falling slightly compared with pre-pandemic, broadly stable, slightly falling. This is particularly driven by the shakeout in hospitality, by fewer people working in cleaning, particularly if you're women working in cleaning, if you're older women working in cleaning. And the growth in higher skilled work is being driven by changes in the sorts of work that we do and the continued sort of transition to a technology and knowledge-based economy and all things we've talked about for years. So there is clearly an opportunity here as well to support those transitions, to help firms deal with turnover, reduce turnover, fill vacancies, raise participation, and also support economic growth. Now, this really matters. This research and this work really matters, I think, because up until this point, I think for many firms, but not all, flexibility has been seen as part of the problem. It's been seen as a workforce problem rather than part of the solution. I think now flexibility has to be and is becoming part of the solution for firms in how we meet these challenges going forward. We're already seeing firms responding to these recruitment challenges in other ways. We're seeing, for example, increased employment of students, seeing a lot more activity around employing full-time students. Employment of full-time students fell to its lowest ever level before the pandemic. When I was a student, nearly 30 years ago, there was typically about 40% of people in full-time education also had a job. 2 years ago, it was about 25%. And right now, it's about 27, 28, 29%. It's going to keep going up. So firms are seeing the low-hanging fruit, which is if you've got shift work and you can make modest changes to that around short notice on shifts, around length of shifts, around transport to and from work, you can actually increase participation. What we're talking about is changes that aren't necessarily significant. They're not mind-blowingly more complex than that, but they require firms to think and industry bodies to think in slightly different ways about job design, but not just about job design, also about the words that Emma was using: trust, autonomy, control, compassion. So kind of leadership, really, and leadership and culture, as well as how we recruit, how we fill jobs, and how we support people in work, and critically, how we support line managers in doing that. So yeah, we can do this, and we can do it. I think, there's a lot of doom and gloom about the labour market. I'm an inveterate optimist about the labour market, although I'm often quite doom and gloom about the participation crisis. We can do this, and actually, we'll all be better off for it. Our incomes will be better off at a time of higher inflation, and communities are better off, and firms are better off, and we'll have better growth and better prospects if we can. But I would also say I think a lot of this is actually fundamentally market failures. It's not fair to put this all on the door. I'm not saying anyone is, but it's all on the door of individual firms making bad choices. These are market failures driven by people having the wrong information and having to often making short-term decisions based on short-term need rather than longer-term decisions. Market failures require proper policy and industry solutions. So the final point I would make is I think we fundamentally need to reimagine our employment services. I think the points that Emma's making is absolutely right about how we capitalise funding and support for firms. I think actually going even further than that, I think we fundamentally need to change our employment services in this country, by which I mean Job Centre Plus, how we support businesses, the services that we commission, how skills and careers and health and everything else links up with employment services. So we have a genuine, what's called a dual customer model, which exists in many other countries, that is open to everyone who wants a job, needs help to find a job, and also people who want to change jobs. And the second customer is it's open to firms to help them with recruitment, with job design, with access to skills support, with access to line management support, and so on. This will not all be public sector delivered. It can't, and it shouldn't be. And of course, we need to be aware of risks of double funding and everything else. But I think next Parliament, looking further ahead, is a great opportunity here to fundamentally rethink how we deliver employment services and support in this country. Thank you.
Excellent. That was insightful, as you'd expect, and we also got a picture of kind of a new-ish public service at the end, which I think would be a fine thing. Thank you, Tony, for that. I think we should go straight on now to Matthew Percival from the CBI to give their kind of broader employer take.
Thank you, and I feel like I'm more one of you guys because I know as much and I'm no more expert than all of you, whereas all of these guys have all been involved in this particular research. So I'll be relatively brief in that context. But I think my job is to try and sort of help put it in the context of what's our average member saying to us about how they're feeling at the moment and how therefore this fits in with their thoughts. Listening to Tony, I was also thinking back to the time I remember writing as a younger policy advisor at the CBI with concern to the government that the labour market didn't have enough job-to-job moves in it. The decline in job-to-job moves was a sign of a diminishing dynamism in the UK labour market that would be bad for productivity long-term. And here we are using the same data saying, oh my God, how do we deal with it? But I think if there's two things that businesses will say to us at the moment are keeping them awake at night, it's the cost of doing business and in particular labour shortages. And we all know that cost of doing business has got a lot of the same drivers as the public discussion about the cost of living, things like rising energy prices and how you deal with that, disruption in supply chains that are still, some of it rumbling through from Brexit, some of it rumbling through from COVID. But a lot of these sorts of rising prices and input prices they're facing. Workforce is obviously one of them because we're in a context as well of labour shortages, and Tony set that out really clearly already. One of the things that we've been doing with our members through the first quarter of this year is a real focus on trying to encourage them to think about how they consider every possible option for responding to, and because I deal with the workforce part of the CBI rather than the energy costs part, how they respond to labour shortages. And broadly, the conversations with our members fall into three buckets. And I think the encouraging thing for this research is that flexible working is relevant to all three of those buckets of responses to labour shortages. The first response, well, I'm just going to be better than everybody else. I'm going to improve my employee value proposition. I'm going to outcompete the market. And then it's sort of incumbent on the CBI and other business groups to point out that if that's what everyone's saying to us, this is a never-ending spiral. None of you are trying to solve the problem. You're all just trying to make sure someone else loses. And that's kind of being the best advocate rather than the mouthpiece for businesses, is to remind them if they're all saying that, then we're still going to have this problem when we go around in circles. But then there's two types of activities that are about responding to the problem that sort of collectively solves it and adds capacity into the labour market and adds capacity into the economy. And the first part of those is around activation. Tony's spoken a lot about activation already, so I won't add to that for now. But clearly, flexibility can be a part of your employee value proposition that helps you compete, and it can be a part of your interventions that help you to activate too. The third element on this is productivity. And lots of people think productivity, right? Typically, the first thing they reach for is that probably is about adopting technology well and how we adopt technology in a way that enhances the output of our existing workforce, and how we try and make sure we do that well. And obviously that involves a people investment alongside the technology investment to maximise the benefit of that. But I think the thing that we're also encouraging our members to think about is to what extent can the way you organise work and design jobs also have an impact on the productivity that is achieved within those jobs. And therefore, again, flexibility can contribute to this third bucket of how businesses are thinking about responding to labour shortages, with an approach advocated far from only by us, but by us among many others, of considering every possible opportunity. We have like a CEO checklist, as well as a bunch of tools that are for the HR function in responding. So we're giving all of our members in the HR function the tools and the ideas and the stories for these are the sorts of things you can do, while also giving the CEO the checklist to say, are you confident your business has considered all of these? And if you're not, and you're still complaining about labour shortages, put pressure on everyone in your company to be thinking about all of them. I think the other thing that you're right to tap into, and you mention it in the report, is this concern about a two-tier workforce. But I think we're at a tipping point or a crossroads in this debate about two-tier workforce, because there's a low road and there's a high road. I think we all know companies who have pushed further than they might otherwise have done on getting people back to offices and not to have a hybrid approach, or to have a hybrid approach with a stronger balance towards office-based and shared workspace-based working, because they are overridingly concerned about the inequality between their frontline workers and their office-based workers. So the number of companies I spoke to that said, we're really trying to get our offices open again as soon as we can post-COVID, because it's causing a real tension between our frontline workers who've always been there and everyone else. And then it was like a safety thing. Some of your staff feel like they have to take more risks than others. Now it's not so much about the safety point, but it is about this equality of your employee value proposition between different parts of your workforce. And the question is, how do we give employers the tools for more of them to be able to take the high road that says, well, by broadening the conversation and making sure the conversation doesn't become too dominated by hybrid working when we talk about flexible working, we're then able to talk about what flexible working means for all different types of work, then we can have a higher road for this rather than the low road that says at all costs we have to avoid inequality in our workforce and tensions. Therefore, you can't have something that is possible for you because we can't do something equally for them. So this high road versus low road crossroads is what I think a lot of employers are at. But above all else, the priority is avoiding this tension of two-tier workforce, particularly in places where it's mostly frontline work, and then you get a perception like it's head office and hierarchy get something that the ordinary people don't get. Whereas, you know, when you've got lower paying roles in both of those dynamics, then it's less of that pressure. So I think that's the context piece. And then I think this research, you know, it does add to that evidence base. For some businesses, I think being able to show them that the setup costs are outweighed by some of the ongoing benefits will be enough for them to experiment with something. So I think it's a helpful contribution and will lead to some people doing things. I think you're also right, though, to identify that the big gap is the longitudinal study and being able to make sure you can win the case for, are there any long-term costs, not just setup costs? And do the ongoing benefits outweigh the setup costs plus any potential ongoing costs in that balance of things? And so I think it's right that you're tilting some of the recommendations towards, well, how do we make the things happen and kickstart the things that will build that evidence base? Because otherwise we'll never make progress and we'll just go around in circles and be stuck in the same place that we're in at the moment. I think the final challenge I'd add on this is something that I see across so many issues, which is very often evidencing a return on investment isn't close to enough to make it happen, because there are dozens, if not hundreds of things that all promise a return on investment on the desk of every business. And so really it's then about evidencing why this rather than something else, because that it is a bit of a zero-sum game of what am I going to do now? It might be possible in the end to do everything, but what am I going to do now? And when I think about this coming up with businesses, a lot of it comes up in the context of cost of employment. And it's why you hear from the CBI a lot of resistance to pushing too far or big changes in one line of a statutory minimum of an employment contract, because we're conscious that doing that probably means that a lot of other discretionary stuff businesses are doing in other spaces gets cancelled to do just that. So you've got to strike that right balance between how do we level up the floor that's right for everyone, while encouraging businesses to prioritise areas in their employee value proposition based on a genuine dialogue with their workforce and a genuine dialogue with their trade unions where they have trade unions in the workplace, to identify where the priorities are for that increase in the employee value proposition. And that might be, for some places, flexible working. It might be, in other places, right now in a cost of living crisis, just focus on basic pay, please. It might be, in other areas, how do we invest in another form of diversity and inclusion? You know, the employers that are out there making a big push on things like longer and better paid paternity leave. But just being aware the environment we're playing into is also employers thinking, okay, but if I can unlock £1 to invest in my employee value proposition, where is the best place to put it when 50 things promise me a return on investment? And I think then you also get a little bit of fatigue where it's nearly always will boost engagement, will reduce sickness absence, will increase retention. And every initiative promises those two things. And there's a bit of skepticism that if you add up all of them, you end up being promised sickness absence savings that are larger than your sickness absence. So, you know, overcoming that bit of skepticism, but being aware we're always talking about a broad range of things that businesses can do. How do we make the case that this is the right thing for an individual business to do right now? And I think we should be celebrating businesses that do a range of different things. And I think the prioritisation of them has to come from a good dialogue with workers and their representatives about, in this context, with this workforce, what's the right thing to be doing. And I do think lots of them would come down to, not least because of Tony's point about the data on overworking and 3.5 million people. I'm sure a lot of those 3.5 million people would say, if we could improve flexible working in various different forms, that would be the thing that we'd like you to do. But I think it does start with dialogue to set priorities and then making sure you've got a range of options. But hopefully that helps in setting some of the employer context and how lots of them are telling us they're thinking at the moment.
Thank you very much, Matthew. Useful context and sort of constructive challenge about how to think about the numbers and the challenger. So great. Over to our last speaker, Michael Divers, who's the People Director at Sir Robert McAlpine, who is taking the lead on board.
Thank you. I will stand up. Hello. What I'd like to do is talk a little bit about the journey we've been on, where we're at, where we're going. So, you know, what you've shared is this sort of macroeconomic, strategic view. So I'd like to get practical, if I can. I'm really proud to be the People Director at Sir Robert McAlpine. I'm not the Human Resources Director. I'm going to go off piste. I think one of the saddest days of my career was when the term Human Resources was introduced. We deal with people. We're a family-owned business, founded 153 years ago by Sir Robert McAlpine. There's a clue in the title. I haven't been there 153 years. We're talking about older workers. We build phenomenal things. So we built the Olympic Stadium in Stratford. We built the Eden Project in Cornwall, the Bloomberg HQ in London, and the beautiful Maggie centres, the cancer centres across the UK. Quick plug, I'm doing a wing walk for Maggie's on the 4th of June. Go to our Just Giving page and donate. As a family business, we've always tried to support our people. And the McAlpine family are kind, they're generous, and they've always had they've always wanted to look after people as best they can. When I joined in 2018, I asked the board for permission to go out to ask our people what they needed from their employment with us. Some thought it was foolish. I ran the workshops myself with our operational directors, and our people told us that they wanted to work on great projects. They wanted us to invest in their development. What surprised me in particular, was in terms of pay. They just wanted to be paid fairly. They didn't want to get paid over the market rate. They wanted to get paid at the market rate, and they wanted to feel that that was fair. And they wanted us to demonstrate that that was the case. So no black box. In terms of benefits, they wanted two things. They wanted time, and they wanted things that supported them and their families. So that gave us a really, really good steer in terms of what we needed our proposition to be with our people. Fair pay, great projects, invest in their training, time and family. And they didn't want a broad sweep approach. They didn't want one size fits all. They wanted one size fits one, because all of their circumstances are absolutely different. And trying to squeeze people into some homogeneous package just doesn't work. So we then began working on a suite of new benefits and pay arrangements. And we introduced a number of things. So we equalised paternity leave for men and women. So if you work for Sir Robert McAlpine, you get 6 months paid, irrespective of the construct of your family. A lot of our people have carer obligations, so we introduced paid carer leave. We introduced something called a sabbatical bank, where people can bank their holidays, and we match what they've banked, so that if someone wants to go to Australia in 5 years, they can take paid leave to do so. And we're currently looking at how we develop that further. So we're working with our employee reps to look at further development. So things like grandparent leave is something that our people are asking for. We're looking at how we can develop that. They told us also that they wanted to be able to work more flexibly. So we invited colleagues from Timewise. Angela came in and she ran brilliant workshops, not me. Angela ran the workshops on our sites. One, we wanted to see where we sat on the Timewise flexibility curve. And we wanted to hear what our people had to say. So it was clear from the sessions, particularly on our sites, that we are open to agile working. So if someone has got an issue, they need to pick up a kid from school, we will do that. We will make arrangements for them to be able to do that. If you work in our head office or in an office-based role, we're happy to change your terms and conditions if you've got a good reason. It's none of my business what someone's reason is, but if you've got a good reason, we will enter into a discussion. I asked the employee reps and our reps from our affinity groups to present to the board on agile and flexible working. I don't want this to be an HR initiative. I think HR's done enough damage over the years in organisations. I want this to come from our people. And they presented to our board last month, the 17th of March. And they made a series of recommendations. And I just want to tell you what those are. They want a steering group created to oversee how we step into this world of getting flexible working onto our projects, which is the big barrier. So if you're working in a construction site at the Peninsula Hotel on Park Lane, you will not be able to work flexibly currently. But if you work in our Hemel Hempstead head office, you can. That ain't fair. So Paul Hamer, our chief exec, is going to chair a steering group to oversee this, how we drive this forward onto our projects. We're going to create and publish an action plan. So we're going to make public statements about what we're going to achieve. And we'll be measured the extent to which we deliver on that. We're going to look at better communicating our vision and not talking abstractly or strategically about it, but talk about real life examples of how it can make a difference to your life. We're going to update our policy in collaboration with our people. We're going to start collecting some data and publishing that. All internal job opportunities will be open to agile and flexible working. I don't want to go outside and say flexible working is available until we've sorted it internally. Otherwise, we're going to drive people out of the business. We're going to provide training on flexible job analysis. People like me are dinosaurs, and we look fairly conventionally at how jobs should be structured. And we need to be challenged and trained in looking at how we do that differently. And also workforce planning. We're hopeless at workforce planning, even with conventional working. Workforce planning, no organisation gets this right. You're nodding your head. So we need to get better at workforce planning, better at flexible job analysis. We're going to take two projects, one at Sunderland Riverside, and we're constructing at Shepperton Studios, which is a joy. Apparently there may even be some stormtroopers there when we... Wouldn't that be great if a stormtrooper appears when you're running a workshop? Wouldn't that be great? And we're going to use those pilots as real life examples of where are the barriers and how do we overcome the barriers so that we can then roll out this approach across the company. And then once we've got our own house in order, we will make jobs available to the open market flexibly. We're really delighted to be continuing our work Timewise. I'm not just saying that because you're giving me a free breakfast. You've been quite fabulous at challenging us, and we need to be challenged because we need to see what the art of the possible is. One of our strategic business objectives is to be the best place to work. as stated in our strategy. An agile and flexible working for everyone in our business is critical to us delivering on that. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Michael. Really admirable candour and openness about how you're thinking about it. I think will really appeal to people. So we have spoken for too long at the front. I blame the chair. Sorry about that, but I hope you agree it was all kind of good content. So I think it's time to hear from you.